Welcome to the Just Solutions podcast. I'm your host, Aiko Schaefer, Executive Director of Just Solutions. In today's episode, we will explore water policy in the United States and how we can more effectively address water access and safety for environmental justice communities. I'm joined today by Jeremy Orr, Director of Litigation and Advocacy Partnerships at Earthjustice. Earthjustice is a nonprofit environmental law organization working to protect people's health, preserve places, and combat climate change. Welcome, Jeremy, to the Just Solutions podcast.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be joining you today.
So, Jeremy, I noticed in your bio that you have also been a longtime community organizer and now a policy and legal expert. So how do you bring that experience all together in the work that you do?
Yeah, I think it was my community organizing background that actually led me to the practice of law and policy advocacy. I think it was working in communities and with communities that I learned how to, train leaders, learn how to build power, and more than that, learn how to create space for people to advocate for themselves. And it was kind of marrying that with those legal and policy advocacy skills to say, hey, I want to be able to show up and represent communities, but more than that, wanting to use those skills of organizing to create space right in the legal realm and policy realm for those same communities to represent themselves as well. So it's really been about kind of striking that balance from, leading when necessary, but also knowing when to step back and support communities so that they lead themselves.
That makes a lot of sense. And absolutely, I think is why you're so successful at the work that you do. And I noticed also that you went to college in Michigan. It's just such an incredible state, but one that really embodies a lot of the environmental injustice issues that we work on. When we think back to Flint, Michigan, which we may talk about here in the interview, we talk about historic labor rights organizing in Detroit, civil rights organizing, just how much where you studied, maybe where you grew up really shapes the way that you think about the work.
Yeah, so I did grow up in Michigan. I grew up in Detroit, and that's where I live right now. I'm back home in Detroit. I lived in Chicago for a few years while working at Natural Resources Defense Council before joining Earthjustice, and moved back home to Detroit a few years ago during the pandemic. But you're spot on, right? It's those lived experiences, particularly for me growing up in Detroit, that really shape how I view advocacy across the board, but especially environmental advocacy and water advocacy. I share my story on occasion and have talked about it, but I grew up in a home that at times lacked access to water, right? We were subject to water shutoffs on occasion. And so I know what it feels like to not have access. I know what it feels like to have to heat up water to bathe, right? Or get water to, from a bottle to brush your teeth and things of that sort. So growing up with that lived experience has certainly shaped the way I view and do my advocacy now from a person that was part of an impacted community and knows how it feels. And so, yeah.
And I know our viewers can't see it, but I noticed that you're wearing your Michigan State Spartans sweatshirt, and that is where you got your undergraduate degree and your law degree, but also know that you played 2 collegiate sports at Michigan State. Really super impressive. I'm interested in terms of how athletics plays any role in the work that you do and shapes your thinking.
Yeah, Michigan State is very near and dear to my heart, right? As you mentioned, being a 2-sport athlete on scholarship there, gave me an opportunity to pursue my dreams, right? Not only just my dreams as an athlete, right, to play and compete at a high level, but also my dreams of higher education and things I wanted to do in my career. And I loved it so much. As you mentioned, I went back for law school and actually teach there now as well, right? So I teach at the law school, mostly water and environmental law courses. And it's meant a lot. But to your point in terms of the role of athletics in my career, it's played a significant part. I think the biggest thing I point out to folks is teamwork, right? To be able to compete and be a part of a team at that level, right, is significant, right? And those are skill sets that you take with you everywhere. I think the other thing is just commitment and dedication, right, to be able to compete at a high level. And I know for me, competing in 2 sports, right, at a very high level took a lot of commitment, a lot of dedication, and a lot of sacrifice. So I'm used to that. And I always say one other thing that kind of stood out to me as I began to practice law was competition, right? Because it was, for me, when I was finally done with sports, it was like, man, like I miss competing, right? Training, preparing, and competing. And then when I got into the practice of law, it was like, oh, this is a competition. There's a winner and there's a loser, and you have to prepare, and you have a game day in court or hearings. And so there are a lot of parallels between both that still kind of stick with me now and have helped the trajectory of my career for sure.
Today, we're talking about water safety and access for Black, Indigenous, people of color, and frontline communities. I'm excited to have this conversation with you, Jeremy, because we all think about water every day. You know, so many of our shows are about issues that take some convincing that it's a relevant topic, that addressing it is essential to our survival as a species. With water, it's understood we can't live without it. But nonetheless, we still haven't done enough to fix the problem. Just to get started with the real basics, what is fundamentally our problem with our drinking water?
I think when I think about water, I think of it in three different aspects: quality, access, and affordability. And oftentimes I group quality and access together, quality being literally the quality of our water, contamination, right? I think we're living in a country, right, where the data has showed millions of Americans, right, are exposed to contaminated drinking water on a daily basis, and not even a few million, right? I think when I think about just lead in drinking water alone, right, we're talking about 186 million people. That's nearly 60% of our population being exposed to lead contaminated drinking water. And that's not even accounting for all the other contaminants. So I think of quality as one issue. But then, as I mentioned, I kind of group quality and access together because one, I think of access as, do I have access to water literally? But then the other part of that is, if my water is contaminated, do I really have access to safe, sufficient water? And the answer is no. So I think of it as quality and literal access, and then affordability, which underlines all of this, right? Even if my water's clean or at the very least safe to drink, I have access to running water in my home. Can I afford it, right? And that's, something that we've seen over the last decade or so. The cost of water around the country doubling, in some places tripling over the years. There's some data that shows over the last decade, the cost of water has outpaced the cost of gas and groceries, right? And that's, it feels absurd, right? Because we're talking about a natural resource that exists in abundance that is treated as a commodity to be enjoyed by people who can't afford it.
On the water quality question, what are the things that are really contributing to poor water quality?
The things that kind of stand out in the media the last, with lead in drinking water, at the very least, kind of the last, almost 10 years. And then the contaminants of PFAS in drinking water have been really in the media the last, 5 or so years. With lead, right, if we single in on that one, there are millions, an estimated, I think, 10 million lead service lines that bring water into our homes and through our taps every day across the country. Estimated 10 million lead service lines. And many of those are concentrated in the Midwest, right, in places like Illinois, and Michigan, Ohio, and so on. But that alone, just the lead service lines alone, we're not even getting into lead fixtures or lead pipes inside the home. That one being, to me, a crisis. And I think it came on the scene with the Flint water crisis, and that kind of really lifted this up and put it on the forefront for a lot of people. But it's been going on for years, right? Like lead contamination in water isn't a new thing. I think it's always kind of maybe been overshadowed by lead in paint, right? Lead in your home, or lead in gasoline, lead in those kind of scenarios. So lead in drinking water, and I think the biggest issue with that being the lead service lines that bring contaminated water into our homes. And then the same with PFAS showing up in our water, oftentimes getting in the groundwater that serves as the water source, groundwater and surface water that serve as a water source for, again, millions of people around the country, right? And that contamination coming from industry, coming from factories, coming from manufacturers, coming from plants, right? Getting in our water system and showing up in our bodies. I saw something not long ago that said well over 90% of Americans, almost every American, has some level of PFAS in their blood, right? And we call it a forever chemical, right? Because it sticks around and it's hard to destroy, hard to get rid of. So those are just a couple of contaminants and the sources of them that are kind of plaguing our country's water quality right now.
And on the accessibility point that you raised, what is the scale or scope of the accessibility problems that we're seeing in the U.S.?
That's, again, another one, right, where you can say millions of Americans don't have access to safe water, and for that matter, sanitation as well, right? Grouping them together, water and sanitation. I think there are at least 2 million Americans estimated that don't have access to running water in their home, right? And that doesn't take into account, the other millions that have either limited access due to poor infrastructure in their communities, or inhibited access, right, where that access may come and go, as we talk about people being shut off from water when they can't afford it. But again, that's, just like quality impacts millions of people, access to safe drinking water and sanitation likewise impacts, millions of Americans around the country.
You mentioned the affordability question. Is the affordability because water is more expensive, or just the economics of our country right now in terms of people having less money for things, or a combination of both?
It's been on the rise, right? And I think a big part of that has been, it falls on, water utilities, both public and private, right, that are in charge of water distribution and conveyance throughout our country. One thing to point out, as you kind of asked about this, what is it with the cost of water? For the most part, for the last 30 years, the consumption of water has not changed. It being a commodity that is limited but high demand, that's not the case, right? So the consumption and usage of water for the average American has not changed. But yet the cost of water in the last decade has doubled and tripled in many places. I think part of that is due to greed, right? Particularly when we think about private utilities, when we think about who else has access to an abundance of water. We think about bottling companies who are paying pennies, right, to extract water, but yet passing that cost off to ratepayers, who also access, that same water for daily use. I think the other thing is poor infrastructure in our country. The last report I saw by the Society of Engineers rated our infrastructure, I think it was either maybe a C- or D+ across the United States, our water infrastructure. But what that means is our water infrastructure that was meant to last 50 years, that was built 100 years ago and never prioritized, never replaced by municipalities, governments, and utilities, in particular, as we talk about water utilities and replacing mains, lead service lines, things of that sort. Now we're in this space of, okay, this should have been replaced 50 years ago. It's falling apart. It's crumbling. Every time you look up, there's a water main break or construction to replace broken, pipes or so on. Short of it is that cost of failing to maintain and upgrade infrastructure over the course of time is now being passed off to residents in emergency situations where we know that it costs more, right? We know that water infrastructure is cheaper to replace when it's done as part of a capital improvement plan. That's just the numbers, right? When there's big projects going on, get a discount. But yet what we have seen and continue to see are municipalities and water utilities doing these one-off projects because they don't want to commit to prioritizing infrastructure that ultimately deals with the health and well-being of individuals, right, of people that ultimately deal with public health. So we'll see big one-off projects to replace water mains or service lines, right? And that cost gets passed off. So I think it's that mix of both of those things that are driving that cost.
Well, and I think we're talking about drinking water, but obviously we use water for all sorts of things in our lives. But you raised the prevalence of water bottles, which we see often in disaster relief in situations where the water systems are poor. And I think what's interesting is that for-profit venture, people making money off of bottled water, has been growing. And I wonder, to the extent that that profitability and that incentive for those companies makes it easier for us to not think about fixing free, municipal, accessible, or affordable water. And your thoughts about sort of the general dynamic. I feel like everyone's got a water bottle, everyone's drinking more and more water. What are your thoughts around the relationship between the privatization of drinking water and public water?
Again, the place that we first really saw that was the Flint water crisis, right, where we saw this absolute need for bottled water, right? So you've seen that absolute need for bottled water in the midst of that crisis. And then keeping in mind, too, right, that the Flint water crisis was then followed by a number of other water crises from Pittsburgh, D.C., Newark, New Jersey, Benton Harbor, Jackson, Mississippi, right? Also places where there's a need for an abundance of bottled water, right? And it gets to the point to where, as I would imagine around the country, it's gotten to the point to where people are like, okay, this may be in Flint, this may be in Jackson, but what's up with my water, right? And do I even want to take the chance? And if I don't want to take that chance because I don't trust what my utility or my municipality is telling me, because people over in those other places with the water crisis also trusted that their water was safe when they were told it was safe, and reality is that it wasn't. So you've seen, right, more and more people relying on bottled water we used to just kind of be, you would rely on it on occasions for certain scenarios. But now I'd rather drink bottled water than take my chances with what's coming out of my tap. And unfortunate part is that's happening even when it is proven that the water may be safe in many places. Why take the chance? And I think that has created a scenario where there are people who probably feel like, okay, we were told the water was safe. It wasn't. So therefore, I'm going to have a hard time trusting and believing the water's safe where I live now. It doesn't seem like there's some sort of priority or urgency to fix the water. So therefore, I'll just get bottled water. And that in and of itself, right, gets, that adds a whole nother element to access and affordability, right? And we're spending thousands a year on bottled water because we don't trust the water that's coming out of our tap because it's poor quality or we can't afford it.
Oh, yeah. We can do a whole show about bottled water in terms of whether or not it is indeed cleaner, how it's regulated, the waste that it creates. When you mention the cities that have had water crises, I think one thing that you notice is that many of those cities are majority BIPOC cities. So when we talk about the challenges of water, what are the particular challenges to BIPOC frontline communities?
One of the things I've been thinking about a lot more lately is the role of democracy in water and the implications that it has. And to your point, as you mentioned, these cities that I named with these major water crises have significant, if not majority, communities, people of color, communities of color, predominantly Black communities, right, in low-income residents. And it doesn't take much to begin to connect the dots on some of those implications, right? When you think about historic racial segregation, think about racial redlining, you think about lack of investment in infrastructure improvements, right, over the last 50, 60, 70 years. So it's no surprise that these are the communities that are also being hit the hardest by disparities in access to water and these injustices in access to water, because these are byproducts of racial discrimination and racial injustice that have existed in our country since before it was even a country. I think being able to connect those dots are really important. And then once you connect those dots, it becomes easy to understand, like, oh, well, that would make sense that when infrastructure was built in this community, those quality water infrastructure builds, they stopped at the borders of Black and brown and indigenous community. Or as these infrastructure upgrades were taking place over the last 20 or 30 years, those investments weren't made in Black communities. Chicago is a really great example of this. So Illinois has the most, lead service lines of any state in the country, estimated to be over 1 million lead service lines, lead pipes. City of Chicago alone has about 400,000 of those lead service lines, right? So this is City of Chicago. The majority of those lead service lines are in Black and brown communities, the overwhelming majority. So Black residents are 2 times more likely to live in a community, regardless of income, live in a community that has lead service lines, so lead pipes bringing water into their home. Even if we think about that for a second, the city of Chicago, millions of people, right, an old historic city, there was lead infrastructure throughout the entire city. And then when you look up in 2020, all of the lead infrastructure is only in Black and brown poor communities. And it doesn't take much to draw the conclusion that, okay, at some point, lead service lines were mandated to be used in the city of Chicago, in the whole city. But now you look up decades later, the only remaining lead service lines are in South Side, West Side, right? So that means over the last 20, 30 years, those lead service lines have been coming out of wealthier white communities and not coming out of the lower income Black and brown and other communities of color. It really comes down to an issue of democracy, right? Because it's about decision making, right? And where are appointed and elected officials who are responsible for this making decisions? Where are they investing and how are they representing our communities in a way that account for our health and well-being?
And so much of the water crises that you mentioned, it's shocking how intentional decisions are. When you think about Flint in particular, I think that was the point that really was jarring to people, is that someone consciously made a decision to have poor quality water in Black communities in Flint. And so I think it's not a passive, like, we're putting in the water lines and we had to start somewhere and we started here and then we're getting there. In that particular case, just the exposure, again, the intentional decision that someone made to poison people.
And not just in any someone, right? But an emergency manager, right? As we talk about democracy and protecting democracy and democratic control, like that's the piece of Flint that sometimes may get lost on people. Like Flint was under emergency management, meaning that you had a governor appoint an emergency manager to usurp the democratic control of the democratically elected city council and mayor in Flint, who at a point finally came around and said, hey, we don't want to switch the water over, right? We don't think we're ready for it yet. And you had an emergency manager with the authority and power to overrule a city council and make that switch, knowing that, it would cause the harm that it did. But the way you had somebody in a position to be able to make that decision unilaterally is because you were able to squash a democratic process and control in a city like Flint. And I point out to people all the time, particularly being in Michigan, right, and living here, all of the communities that have experienced some level of environmental crises, especially water crisis, at one point or another were under emergency management. And these crises followed emergency management. So you got Flint water crisis under emergency management. You look at the Benton Harbor water crisis a couple of years ago under emergency management. You look at the city of Detroit, who had what the United Nations called a human rights crisis when they shut off 40,000 people in a summer less than 10 years ago. 40,000 people shut off for water at the behest of an emergency manager, right? Highland Park, which is a city that is kind of within the city of Detroit, its own municipality, under emergency management, dealing with the water crisis, and have been for years now as well. So it, comes back to who's making that decision and how do you even get to a decision like that?
Help us understand the decision-making landscape. So there's a role the federal government plays, there's a role that states play, there are roles that municipalities play. Help us understand how all those actors play and what different decisions generally do they make around water policy.
I think one of the things around water regulations and enforcement are that they generally happen at the state level, right? So you have these federal, particularly around, drinking water, you have the Safe Drinking Water Act. Around sewage and stormwater, you have the Clean Water Act. But generally, those are federal laws that the federal government, right, the Environmental Protection Agency, has delegated to the states to enforce, right? So the states have enforcement authority on ensuring that those laws are enforced properly across drinking water and stormwater and sewage and sanitation and stuff like that. So now that delegation being at the state level, right, you have state agencies who are responsible for ensuring that the local municipalities, the local utilities, the local water companies, or the storm and drain utilities are in compliance with the law and the rules. That has not always served us well because the rules as they exist, they aren't very helpful and don't lend themselves to protecting human health in the environment. I tend to point this out to people. When I think about environmental law as a whole structure, environmental law isn't necessarily rooted in protecting the environment and human health. What it's rooted in is allowing companies, industry, and people to pollute, but just do it in a way that can be recorded, right? So when I think about the Safe Drinking Water Act, a health-based Safe Drinking Water Act would not allow the disbursement of pollution into our bodies of water, right, that we drink from. That's not the case. The environmental laws generally say, Safe Drinking Water Act says you can have this much lead in your water, but you got to have a permit for it, you got to pay for the permit, and you got to do some reporting. And if you get out of compliance, you got to get back into compliance. You can have some lead in there, you can have some PFAS in there, you can have some other heavy metals in there, but maybe only this much, right? So that's the first thing. Think about the same with the Clean Air Act, right? You can pollute, but you got to have a permit. You got to pay for it. You got to pay the state, right? Pay the federal government to get your permit, but you can pollute. Oftentimes you can pollute a lot. And then even when you pollute in excess of your permit, you may get a slap on the wrist. You may not. You get a chance to come back into compliance. But anyway, all that to say, what ends up happening is you have state agencies who sometimes don't have the resources, sometimes don't have the capacity, but oftentimes don't have the technical expertise to do this type of enforcement. And if the state does, oftentimes the local municipality may not have that expertise, have the resources, have the support to do it. So you're falling short somewhere. And I think the other thing, too, that makes enforcement difficult when you look at it from a local, state, and federal level is that, none of the rules that as they exist really require utilities to report back on this kind of damage. So they have to report on when they sample the water and test the water. And that's generally how you would find out if water is out of compliance and contaminated. But more than that, there's not much in the way of giving everyday citizens, right, and advocates opportunity to have access to that same data without having to jump through hoops, without having to submit FOIA requests, right? And there are certain data that would be really helpful to understand that's not required, right, by the state or federal government that would help us, better be able to protect ourselves and protect the environment from contaminated water.
Well, and so much that you shared with us to understand like the inner workings of decision making. I think it's so fascinating, your point around how by and large, our environmental policies, we tend to center corporate interests, that it's about how much can they do their business, acknowledging that there's some impact and then just trying to curtail that a little bit. I think even more so incentivizing them to become good actors. And then when they aren't good actors, there's really not much punishment. For the work that you and I do to really center communities, in particular center frontline communities, is so important and would, I think, drive a different policy outcome as a result. So when you think about centering communities and community interest or human interests, what are some examples that you're seeing out there that are worth lifting up for listeners to know about?
You see more places being proactive in replacing toxic infrastructure like lead service lines. You had the state of Illinois pass a bill a couple years ago to mandate the replacement of all lead service lines within the state by a certain time frame. You've seen the same happen in Michigan, a mandate that all lead service lines be replaced. Seen a couple other municipalities do the same. I think that's promising because you're having attention being paid to it. Folks are starting now trying to be proactive about it instead of sitting back on your heels waiting for a crisis to happen. And then also it's showing that it can be done, that, Newark was able to replace their lead service lines in record time. So same with Benton Harbor, right? Benton Harbor issues had dragged on for years. And once legal action was taken, which I had the pleasure of being a part of, once legal action was taken, they fixed it in less than a year, right? So it's also being able to show like, oh, you can do it if you actually decide, if you have the political will to do it, you can, our municipalities and our states can do it. Those are a couple of examples. I think, more examples of as it relates to affordability and access. The former mayor of Chicago, when she had got into office, she had placed an indefinite moratorium on shutoffs, right? Which is a huge step, right? To say, hey, we aren't going to shut people off from water anytime soon. And that was before the pandemic, if I'm not mistaken, right? So this wasn't even kind of prompted by a health emergency. Right now, I see in Michigan, we have a suite of bills that were introduced to create a rate structure for water statewide that would apply to low-income residents. So they would pay based on their ability to pay, not based on how much water they use. They create an assistance program. They would also create a more stringent process for shutting people off from water and protect low-income residents as well as critical care residents with medical issues. And then it looks like, from what I've seen, the federal government has undertaken some changes to the Safe Drinking Water Act, in particular the federal lead and copper rule, revisions to it for the first time in over 30 years since the rule was promulgated back in the early 90s. An administration that has prioritized water, and not only in what it says, but what it does, right? The historic amount of money being dedicated to water and water infrastructure has been promising. And I think the last thing I'll say that's been promising has just been the fact that we're talking about it, right? It means that it's an area of interest that people are aware of, that people are now talking about, and people want to see action on it. I think that's been very promising as well.
The Biden administration made significant investments in infrastructure. There's funding for water infrastructure. I mean, how's that going? Is your sense that it's landing in EJ communities? Is it being utilized to address some of the problems that you're talking about?
I think it'll take some time to really see how it plays out long term, right? Those historic investments also were investments that are to take place over the course of 10 years. But I think we are seeing those investments take place because they were, I think they're coupled with a few different things, right? You had the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which really allocated a significant amount of money to drinking water infrastructure across the board, and lead infrastructure, I think about $45 billion, if I'm not mistaken. You also had the Inflation Reduction Act, right, which allocated funds for that. And then at the beginning of the pandemic, you had the American Rescue Plan Act. You had a number of different sources of federal funding that have begun to start, coming down, and you begin to see some of these projects take place in communities around the country, right? In particular places that were already prepared and already ready to take on these projects. And that's where I think the big difference is, where you have places who are already thinking about it, already ready to get to work, and we're just waiting on the funds. Like that's where we see these projects kind of pick up a little quicker than other projects. But I think over time, over these next 10 years, as that money continues to make its way down and people know it's on its way down, you'll then have states and utilities and municipalities saying, okay, in these next 10 years, however long, 8 years left now, whatever that may be, right? We know that there's millions of dollars available. Let's hurry up and get our capital plan together. Let's get these projects together so that we can access those funds to do, water infrastructure upgrades that, as I mentioned, are long overdue.
For listeners, if this is something that they're interested in working on, what advice would you give to them?
One of the main things, that a person can do, particularly to protect themselves and their families and their homes, right, is check with your water company, right? Check with your water utility to find out, okay, can I get a test, right? Hey, have them order a test, right? Generally, those are free. Either they'll come out or they'll mail you a kit, or maybe you'll go pick it up, fill the bottles of water up. You either send it back or take it back, and they can report back to you, on the quality of your water. And then from there, right, taking the steps necessary to be able to protect yourself. Sometimes that may mean a filter, right, on your faucet. Sometimes that may mean replacing the pipes in your home, replacing the plumbing in your home. But I think the biggest thing is doing what you can to get informed about your own water, right, so that you can take steps necessary to protect yourself. As we've talked about, a lot of these issues are, right, they're related to who has power and authority to actually make decisions around our water, and especially, as it relates to public utilities, public water utilities, right? These are generally some appointed or hired person appointed by the mayor or city council to make these decisions about our water access, our water quality, and the cost of our water, right? So I think also being able to be intentional about having a better understanding of the importance of local elections and who's in control and how that has implications on everything, right? But in particular, our quality of environment and the quality of our water too.
Well, Jeremy, this has just been such a pleasure to have you on our show and to talk about this important issue. We ask all of our guests a final question, which is what makes you hopeful about the environmental justice movement today?
What makes me hopeful is that we're talking about it, right? Like not even 5 years ago, environmental justice wouldn't have been uttered in the halls of Congress, right? It wouldn't have been talked about very much in the White House. States and government folks wouldn't want to acknowledge even the term itself, environmental justice, because it created some culpability and meant that some injustice had to have been perpetuated by our local, state, and federal governments in order for the term environmental injustice to even exist, right? We're seeing climate justice and environmental justice and water justice centered nationally in a way that it hasn't been before, right? And as I mentioned, not only talked about, but we're seeing money, or people are putting money where their mouths are, right? And we're seeing historic investments. So I think continuing the trend in that direction makes me hopeful and seems promising. And then also, as I mentioned, just like water is fixable, right? Like what we're talking about is a man-made problem that has pretty easy man-made solutions, right? And easy to the extent of, hey, we know what we need to do to fix our water. We can do it. Let's do it. So I'm hopeful, based on the platform that environmental justice has seen. I'm hopeful about the investment that it's seen, and I'm hopeful about the ways that I've seen environmental injustices corrected in places around the country, which lets me know we can do that all over the country.
Absolutely. Just this natural resource that Mother Nature has given to us, and her ability to really continue to create that for us to help us survive. And absolutely can't agree with you more that we need to have more solutions to solve this problem, and solutions are out there for sure. We just need to do less of bad things. Can be an easy place to start, right? Well, Jeremy, thank you so much for your insights on this topic and bringing us that optimism and reminding us that this is a discussion that we're having actively, and that is due to your leadership and the work that you're doing around water safety and accessibility and clean drinking water, and the extraordinary work of community organizers, community organizations who are out there really talking about this issue and putting forward their solutions. And thanks to our listeners for joining us on the Just Solutions podcast. Special thanks to our producer, Taylor Ward, and our recording engineer and editor, Angel Batista. If you enjoyed the episode, leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to know more about our work at Just Solutions, visit our website at justsolutionscollective.org. You can also follow us on Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook for the latest updates. Together, we are driving community-created and equity-centered solutions to the climate crisis. We hope you'll join us for our next episode.